last year I had the good luck to be selected as the foreperson to a federal grand jury. 2 days a month for 8 months, me and 22 other very lucky people gathered together to hear cases and participate in investigations. I will tell you, it is a unique experience. And it's one that connects you to your fellow jurors in an equally unique way. Over the course of the time that we spent together, we got to know each other fairly well, and the uncertain silence of that first day quickly gave way to bubbling conversation about work and families, health concerns, vacations, and everything in between. People were always especially curious to hear how it was going at church. What they called my flock. How was it with my flock, they would say. And there was one woman in particular who always made a point of asking me about church. Her name is Sheila, and she is a wonderful, passionate person who got the bad reputation on the jury of being the one to have her own timing to everything. A timing that just didn't always match the rest of us. So one day, at the end of our particularly grueling day, I wanted nothing more than to just go home. I was tired, I was mentally worn out, I was emotionally drained, and after hours spent in the same windowless room with the same plain walls, hearing the same heavy cases, all I wanted was to go outside and drink in the cold winter air. I wanted to hand off that oh-so-important four-person file and just get lost in a good song on the way home. My freedom was this close. Just one long, empty hallway away. When out of nowhere, Sheila's voice called from behind me. I stopped, and I waited for her to catch up as she walked slowly towards me, already launching into small talk as if we hadn't just heard these very heavy cases. So I mustered up all of the remaining energy that I had to be ready to answer her questions, to listen and to talk with her, ready to rehearse the conversation I'd practiced all day of how to explain how things were going with my flock. Well, I only got partway through my answer before Sheila began to tell me all about what was going on in her church. So I shifted my energy to do my best to listen as we walked slowly through the hallway, the doors somehow seeming farther and farther away. I listened as Sheila told me all about her church choir. Then all about all the church gossip. She shared her frustrations about church politics, and then she shook her head in sad disappointment as she listed all the places where she saw moral failings detracting from the church's mission. She was wondering what had happened to her beloved church. And I sympathized with Sheila and her struggle. I could see the toll it was taking on her. I have seen the toll it has taken on so many others. And I began racking my tired brain of what to say to affirm her struggle, but to give her any kind of hope and encouragement at all. And while I was still thinking about what to say, Sheila stopped. She just stopped walking, and she waited until I realized that she had stopped walking, until I stopped with her. And she looked at me right in the eye and she said, "But God is in that place." Just as sure and even a little defiantly as that, but God is in that place. I couldn't help but smile and agree with her. Sheila didn't need any of my tired words to try to make sense of what was happening at her beloved church, or anywhere else for that matter. She didn't need my mustered up encouragement. You see, Sheila already understood that none of what was going on negated God's presence there. Not the uncertain future, not the human failings, not the moral failings she saw, not even the poor leadership she was so frustrated with. Sheila's emphatic, "But God is in that place," was a most welcome breath of fresh air in that long hallway. A breath of fresh air that breathed new life into my whole way home. Since that time, I have often remembered Sheila and her willingness to mourn the reality of the world in one breath, and in the very next to boldly declare, "But God is in that place." And in truth, I tell her story often because it represents to me a voice that we don't always hear enough of in the faith world. In the age of televangelists and the quick fix, there is little room for a God who works in real and complex ways, the ways that the world works. With the prosperity gospel running rampant that God is only present in things that are good, there's little room left for God to be present and active in times that aren't good, in the times of suffering and chagrin. I'm not sure what it is that has led to this. I don't know if it's our own preferences or if somehow we think God can't handle the day-to-day messes. But it's as if we have come to assume that God can only be close at hand if everything is going well. Otherwise, God has to be far, far away, hopefully working on some big miracle fix. But Sheila's voice cuts through defiantly, challenging these assumptions. But God is in this place. Sheila echoes the psalmist and gives voice to Joseph's story. Joseph of the Old Testament, the beloved son, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery and taken down to Egypt. And the refrain we hear, "But the Lord was still with him." Joseph, with his visions of power, made into a servant, but God was still with him. Joseph, betrayed again for his integrity, sent to prison where he would be forgotten for years. And yet the same refrain carries, "But the Lord was still with him." The psalmist, too, gives witness to God's presence in the depths of the pit, in the heights of heaven, even on the farthest side of the ocean. God is still there. At the very edge of human wisdom, at the farthest stretches of reason and understanding, at the very end of life itself, there God is. Sheila's bold proclamation is declared throughout time, but God is in that place. The words stubbornly reverberate in our souls, shaking loose our assumptions and easy answers. Because how much easier is it for us to assume that God is simply absent in our suffering? I know many people who would prefer to think that it's easier to assume that God has simply abandoned us. Well, that's not easy. Easier to understand that than to understand that God could possibly be with us and yet the circumstance hasn't changed. Or it's easier for us to assume that God is only present in people and places who are marked by easily recognizable success. Even though we know from our scriptures that so many of the ones whom God favors have it pretty rough, like Joseph or any of the prophets. Then again, maybe we prefer to think about it that way because it makes it easier to dismiss the people or the needs that make us a little uncomfortable. God couldn't possibly be there anyways, right? But Sheila and Joseph and the psalmist won't stand for this. They won't stand They won't stand for rationalizations that let us dismiss God in any place. They confront us with the reality that God is present and active in all times, in all places, in all circumstances. Whether we like it or not, we're left to figure out what are we supposed to do when God's inescapable presence doesn't mean physical presence like gifts in our lives. How do we square away God's presence on the one hand and the reality of sin and suffering on the other? It's an age-old question. It's a big, deep, soul-searching, and if we're not careful, possibly even a faith-shattering kind of question. One that I can't answer in our time, but I will tell you instead what I choose to do when faced with it. When faced with this question, I choose to stand defiantly with Sheila. I choose to remember the story of Joseph, whose successes were relative given his poor circumstances. I choose to echo the words of the psalmist and let myself simply be overwhelmed by God's knowledge that it is simply too far above me that I can't grasp it. And that's okay. Because here is the good news of this morning's But God. For God to be inescapably present means that we are never abandoned. We are never left alone in a world that spins out of our control. Our hope is never lost, no matter the circumstances. And what's more than this, it means that our hope is grounded here in this world today, not just in an unseen future, not just in a far-off God, a God only capable of working in creation, disrupting ways like a rainbow in the sky or an empty tomb at Easter. These are amazing signs that God has done to create new life in the world, and I don't want to minimize them. I have prayed for as many spectacular miracles just like this. But for me, there is something wonderfully comforting to know that our God is just as powerful to work through the systems of the world as God is to work apart from them. My friends, there is something profoundly hopeful about our God who can work divine purposes out of real, complicated, messy, fallen human lives. I've been told sometimes I go too fast, so I'm going to say that line again. There is something profoundly hopeful about our God who can work out divine purposes from real, complicated, messy, fallen human lives. Out of my life, out of your life, out of our shared life together. God does not have to abandon what we offer. God isn't constantly having to work around our lives in order to accomplish God's good plans. Our God doesn't have to scrap everything and start over to get at peace and justice and love and community. God works right now to bring these about here and now through our lives for us to enjoy in our life together. I don't know about you, but I think that is pretty amazing. I think that is something worth standing for. And that is where I find my hope. Standing right here alongside the psalmist, alongside Joseph, and alongside Sheila, to stand firm in a hope that is grounded in God's work on earth here. Grounded in God's work in our lives today. We may not always understand it. We may not even always see it. But there's no denying how wonderful it is that God chooses to work with us and through us. If we really really let this sink in, it's kind of a big realization. One that can transform our lives, that can change how we see each other, how we choose to use our time and our resources so that we can do better at aligning our lives with God's purposes. Because there's no doubt it's a big, overwhelming moment to realize that God is at work in your life here and now, today. Not that future life that you'll be leading when you finally get things all together, but today, here. My friends, as overwhelming and wonderful as this moment is, it is to me a welcome breath of fresh air after a long day inside. The kind of breath that can breathe life into you the whole way home. For the confidence of God's ever-active presence around us breathes new life into the world. It shakes off doubt and despair, and it replaces it with the stubborn hope of God with us. A hope that I would stand for. The very hope that sets us free to transform the world if only we will all stand defiantly against every protest to declare, but God is in this place. Let us pray. Dear Lord, help us to know that we don't have to have the answers to every question or to every doubt. We don't have to understand even how it's possible. It is enough to know that you are in this place and in every nook and cranny of your creation. Amazingly, you are working out your good through us. Give us the eyes to see you wherever we are. Give us the hearts to stand courageous in you. And give us the willingness that we would offer our lives to your continued purpose in creation. Amen.